documentary and ethnographic media. And I would like to begin by thanking the programming committee at Mimesis, Sarah Biagini, Kurt Heiner, Luisa Parvu, for spectacular 4 or 5 days. Jerónimo Reyes Retana, especially for the fantastic documentary arts exhibit that keeps me sort of coming back and thinking about the possibilities of documentary. And also Eric Kuntz Ismail, who's somehow keeping it all together, the director of the center and of the festival. And Laurit Anders Zone, who is here for pretty much every screening, making sure that things are still going, and also Anan Villalobos for facilitating all these fabulous connections in person and online for the past almost week. It's my first time watching A Thousand Fires, my second time in a movie theater. And to me, it just keeps getting better. Said, I don't know what it's like for you.
No, I don't watch it that much anymore. But if it's been a few months, I'll watch it again just to be in the same frame of mind as the audience if we're doing a Q&A. Does it get better? I don't know. There are things I like more about it, and there are things I like less. So maybe it's somewhere in between. It teaches me something new every time I see it.
Yeah, maybe we'll get to that in a little bit. I'd also like to acknowledge our mutual friend and Mimesis friend, Che Applewaite, whose spirit is very much with us today and who introduced us in Bristol a few months ago.
Yeah.
So let's just start in the meat of it. I think the thing that struck me most this time watching the film is connected to a quote. And the quote comes from Eyal Weitzman, actually, from Forensic Architecture. So they talk about this sensitivity of transformation, basically. So I'm just gonna read the short version of it, which says, no matter if you are a building, a territory, a photograph, a pixel, or a person, to sense is to be imprinted by the world around you, to internalize its force fields and to transform. And to transform is to feel pain. So watching your film this time, I thought about how violent is this work of caring. There's a lot of violence that goes into care. And we see it in pretty much every human relation in this film, where people care for each other or people are being cared for, but at the same time, they also are somehow exercising these auras of violence. Were you thinking about that at all as you were sort of present with them in the space or later in the editing room?
Yeah. It took quite a while. I mean, I usually work without any idea of plot or narrative or anything. I love to just film a lot and collect material and observe and slowly find threads that emerge. And I think about halfway through editing, it was quite late, that's one of the co-producers, someone asked them, what is the film about? And that's always a difficult question, because you say, like, is it about with a capital A or about like the subtext? Or so anyway, and the co-producer said it's a film about a family that has to tear itself apart in order to save itself. And that's exactly what it was about. But I hadn't known until that point. So once he said that, it was almost like everything fell into place. And that was the point when I realized, you see, at the end, it's dedicated to my parents. So it was at that point that I realized that this was going to be about families in general. Firstly, the film became tried to become much more universal, but it was going to be also about this very personal experience that is probably also universal of when you leave home, and parents whose dream is for their kids to leave home and have a better life. But as soon as your kid does, you miss them. you want them back. And in fact, every family in one way or another has to go through that transition. Um, so that maybe that's the element of violence that you see there, is that I started to look through the footage with, obviously, with the editor, and find a lot of moments that reminded me so much of my own relationship with my parents. And I figured if I could relate to this family, then almost anyone could. So that violence, in a way, is also, I felt, the parents trying to train their kid for a world that is more violent than he expects, because they also live in a very isolated place. So it's quite easy for them to live on more or less unconnected with the Burmese government. So even now, after the coup, there was a military coup in the beginning of 2021. Their lives are more or less unaffected, at least them, because they're so isolated. But they were correct in this fact that when their son moved from home and moved to Yangon, he would see a much more violent world than he'd ever seen before.
Let's talk about time, the treatment of time. I know it took a while for you to film this. I also know you didn't have continuous access to this place, but at the same time, the time that we experience in the film is also unique. How did you go about that? The time of your filming versus the sort of sequence or temporal journey that we take here.
I mean, we filmed it over about 3 years, so it's sort of 4.5 years was the whole production, but maybe 3 years of filming, going back and forth every few months. And again, because I wasn't interested in plot, it wasn't really a problem to leave for many months. I didn't have this issue that there was going to be some kind of linear deterministic narrative, and I needed all the pieces in between. And I also work quite slowly, so it worked fine for me. And I like collecting material and then looking at it over and over again for a very long time, and sort of pushing it around and manipulating it and seeing if it sticks together like this, and then somebody says, "Oh, it's, have you seen this film? It sounds like that." And I go watch that film and research all of that director's biography, and then, have you read this book? And it's a very slow process that's kind of like a magpie. And I love having at the end a thick notebook with thousands of pieces of paper falling out. And then the edit is sort of the process of hewing all of that down. So those spaces were fine. They worked well for me. And in the end, when we did find at least a thread, I don't know if I would call it a narrative, but it worked well because it gave you the signifiers of time passing. And in fact, we were kind of lucky because the baby is the most obvious signifier of time passing, and it tells you almost exactly how much time has passed. The editor was much better at that than me. I don't know babies very well, so sometimes you don't know. Like I was asking Eric, when do they start talking? It's like, is this around the time? So I don't know it that well, but clearly when you watch the film, you see the baby grow up. So that also became a marker. And I always look for, because I don't want to tell a story necessarily, I always look for markers that maybe simplify aspects of time. Having said that, there was a real there's a part of this that's in my talk tomorrow, so I don't want to give it away. But speaking generally, the Burmese Buddhists believe in reincarnation, and so they don't conceive of this. They don't conceive of existence in a 80-90 year time span. And I did a lot of interviews with the family, by the way, which are not in the film at all, but they were audio only, and more for about halfway through, I realized this film wasn't going to have a narrative, a voiceover, but I kept doing it just to understand. So we understood, okay, if their time scale is not, I'm born, I grow up, I die, that's it. So the film similarly shouldn't have that feeling. And so we constructed it as cycles. a lot of this is going to sound like what Jessica said yesterday. I related to so many of the things she said in her Q&A. So apologies if it sounds like I'm just ripping you off, Jessica, but much of it is true. So how to get away from a linear narrative. So it became about cosmic time and a comfort with death, because they are not, I mean, that family, let's say, are not so afraid of death in the same way that you might be if you think that's the end. So the ending for me is also about coming to terms with your own mortality. You know, understanding that you will die, and maybe that's okay. And if you've improved the world around you, that's more or less the best you can hope for. And it also was, is this the atmosphere? Is that why it's so hot, like the altitude? I swear I'm running out of breath just trying to talk a lot. I was also, you know, I'm also growing older, and this was the first film that I ever shot almost entirely on a tripod. Partly because I realized when I got into the oil fields, you know, and it was 40 degrees and humid, I just couldn't carry a camera around the way I used to. So I had to put it on the tripod, and I started to think, oh, this is what it feels like to get older. So the film is also about this, coming to terms with that.
Related to time, we're going to open it up to the audience pretty soon. But related to time, there are two or maybe three actually editing modes in the film, at least in the version that we're all watching. Probably things might work differently for you, so it might be interesting to hear about that. But I have this note here in my notebook. The first three shots of your film: fire, oil, money. There are then different scenes where we get a bit more of a sense of maybe continuity editing, or maybe you sometimes edit a bit more around a certain scene, but you're often going for the sort of one take scene or one take shot, especially in these symbolic moments. What is the balance between this kind of sort of arch that you're building, that you've just described here, talking about, you know, reincarnation and about being in the world, and then about the circulation, about the flow that takes us from fire to oil to money to soccer to electricity to all these other things that we see?
Yeah. I was very interested in these triptychs, right? The film also ends with three shots, so we wanted it to reflect the beginning of the film. And in fact, I do this quite often, but we came up with the ending quite early on. For some reason, we were messing around with some of the material, and it just became very clear to us. We said, you know, Thein Shwe is picking his garden, and then he's peeling a mango, and then for the first time you see the parents relaxing because their kids are gone. Yeah, for the first time they rest, and it's, you know, the first time they're really not working, and you kind of get this sense that something has changed. And it was really clear to us that was the end of the film, especially when we put that track. We had tried a lot of other music, but, you know, when these sort of moments of alchemy, and we knew that was the feeling of the end of the film. So then the exercise is to build up everything else to reach that point. And, you know, we have a very additive theory of editing montage, that the film is in the juxtaposition of two images that they produce a third meaning. So I never really worry too much about what you're talking about, flow or narrative, because if you do it with rhythm, for me, the most important thing is rhythm. And I'm very influenced by music, and my mother was a musician, and so we were raised playing instruments, and like musicality, and especially Arabic music more than European music, which is always melody driven. It's not harmony, and it's a very long journey. So as long as you have the rhythm, people will make sense of what's on screen. That's my feeling. So the most amount of work was about getting the rhythm correct,
Mhm.
not so much about creating a sequence that would produce meaning. You see what I mean?
But at the same time, you do resist. There's a sort of sensitive tension there, maybe also part of the work of sensing, between using music, using diegetic sound, and then using sound effects.
Yeah.
What was it like to work with that, to figure out that balance?
I mean, absolutely love doing sound mixing and editing. Maybe my favorite part of the process because it's very there's a lot less riding on it than there is the other stages, for me at least. And then I think it's so overlooked generally that when you really have a chance to do it properly, and we had an incredible team and we had a decent amount of time. And sound editors are also, they're just a very unique type of person that I love, this kind of geeky obsession with something that most people don't care about or even know exists. And you really love it. You don't become a sound editor to become rich or famous because you won't be. But so there's something that meticulous nature that I love with them. But we went in knowing that we were going to do a lot of quite elaborate work on the sound, partly to create this sense of the metaphysical, to create these transcendent moments. And again, it's about rhythm, that the film takes you through very mundane, literally a hand in the ground, the sort of most earthy, basic form process you can imagine. And then there had to be these moments when the world sort of melted away and we felt that we were sublimating. And that was done through manipulating sound. So, and also just technically the field recordings, I mean, the sound was so bad, to the point where in the middle of filming, we really thought, is this actually going to work? Because it's just these overwhelming sounds of generators that go in and out of phase. I mean, it sounds amazing, but it's intolerable if you listen to it, in studio speakers, because there's sort of 10 or 15, they all have their own resonant frequencies and they all move in and out. So we just did so much work cleaning, clarifying, to make it sound normal. It's one of these kind of the ironies of cinema, to make it sound real, or kind of going back to the Stan Brakhage painting, The Baby Pink, to make it sound like it sounded when I was there. We had to do so much work to rebuild the soundtrack, basically.
And it's true, there's always something in the background, even in scenes or shots that we might think of as silent, where no one necessarily talks or there's no music playing. Actually, maybe part of my sense of violence also came from the soundtrack of mundane moments. Even quiet, silent moments are not at all silent.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe the violence is also because the process of digging for oil is very violent. Um, it looks very intrusive and violent, and it's just this kind of repetitive pounding into the earth, and you can understand the metaphor of the rape of the earth when you see how the oil industry works. Right, that metaphor became very clear for me. So there is also that sense of violence all the time, but yeah, when you realize that the industry there is starting to fall apart and a lot of people move away, it's the first time that you hear real silence in the film, or just birds and crickets. And it was the first time when I went to visit the oil fields and there weren't generators constantly going, 15 or 20 at the same time. So it's one of those things where your ear is very good at attenuating to the generator, and it's only when it stops that you realize you've been listening to this noise for so long.
I think this is a good time to take questions from the audience. I can see.
I'm going to preempt you because I've got the mic.
Okay.
Hi, Saeed.
Hi.
That where you just left it off is exactly the question
Mhm.
that I wanted to ask, which is your relationship to industry.
Mhm.
You're working kind of with two industries that are always described in those terms: the oil industry, the energy industry, and the film industry,
Mhm.
right, or the industry of cinema. and how they both often are described or adopt language of extraction in their method and in their process, and in this way that you kind of strip them both down, kind of leave them both as bare as possible, almost reduced to the craft that I think we all, many of the filmmakers in this room, like hope that we are engaging in cinema, right, as a craft and an art form rather than an industry, in almost the same way that this family is engaging with it almost as like a folk craft, right? The way that they are extracting oil from
Independent oil extraction.
Well, right, exactly. Well, that's the thing, right? We talk about the independent film industry, but they still call it an industry, right? And when we say industry, you imagine these like megalithic corporations that span the globe, right? These multinationals, and this is not the version of oil extraction that I think we're used to on every day. So I just wonder, how did you reflect on your use of cinema as the art form to describe oil extraction as the industry, and maybe their relationship and how the film unfolded?
Yeah, that's a very good question. They call it artisanal oil drilling, which is so bizarre because I feel like it's a cheese shop in like a Boulder cheese shop. Yeah, artisanal cheese shop. Yes, it's very true. I mean, the film, I used to be a journalist, so my process is very research based and journalistic, and then knowing that the film I make is not going to look like that at all, but I love the research phase. And so what we found in Burma was this very weird moment in time where the major oil industry had collapsed onshore. There was a huge offshore exploration, which has more or less failed, but onshore, the big companies pulled out. And so they abandoned those oil fields. And people like Thein Shwe and his family move in and they live off the dregs of the industry. So they go to the fields, they know, okay, there was oil here, but then it becomes sort of this process of divining to figure out where exactly to drill. And that whole thing was almost like a mystical, people would be well known for their skill at figuring out exactly where to drill. So someone mentioned Agnes Varda. It was almost like the Gleaners. It was like we kind of felt like it was a version of the Gleaners where people were living off the crumbs of this industry, and yet it was enough for a family, right? It's actually quite a good job. It's consistent. The money's not bad as long as the international oil price is good. So, so they saw it as a savior, and for me, it was important to. I always have this tension in films. I like the film to look as simple as possible and feel simple and almost inevitable. But I also want to complicate the issues in the film. So one of the ones I wanted to complicate was the idea of transitioning from oil and labor. So what happens to the people that work in an oil industry? That, of course, we can fantasize about immediately abandoning oil, but if we really come at it from a humanist, for me it would be left wing, but the humanist perspective, we have to consider the labor behind the industry. So there are people like Thein Shwe who it saved his family. And I don't want this to sound patronizing, but I spoke to them. I know, so I'm saying this from experience. They don't know of the consequences of the oil industry on a large scale. So they're doing work like anyone else. So in a sense, it was also just to complicate the narrative of a green economy, let's say. And then I always like to do the same thing with the film industry itself. It's I always like to protest the commercialization and industrialization of the film industry, especially in the UK where I live now. So part of it is just intentionally withholding things, intentionally not giving you a clear narrative. And I'm sure all of you have this experience when you want to make a film like this and you go and pitch it. And they'll say, "Oh, so you're going to talk about big oil and corruption and money and and I said, "No, not really." "Okay, so you're going to talk about the war in Iraq and invasion?" And so you're like, "No, not really. It's just a family, What's going to happen? I don't know. What's the plot? I have no idea. Who are the characters? I don't know. But it looks good." And like any form, you fake a narrative and you say it's going to look like this, and then you go make your film. But yes, it really is intentionally a way of challenging also the commodification of narrative. and especially you talked about extraction. And so, I have a huge problem with the exploitative nature of documentary film, and the exploitation of poverty, or the exploitation of people with less power, or the weaponization or commercialization of story, and et cetera, et cetera. So this whole process was also very close. I mean, the film is very closely made with the people in it. All of these elements I'm talking about of Buddhism and cyclical life, and that comes from the family. What's important to them comes from the family. The reason it doesn't pull out and talk about climate change in general is because everything is from the perspective of that house. It's all about them. So it was important also to challenge that extractive model of capitalist filmmaking, the commodification of story.
Thanks, Said.
Thank you. Wonderful film, Said. I really appreciated sort of how the organic humanity was allowed to shine through the piece without an explicit sort of mention of where we should be going. It allowed sort of the audience, at least for me personally, to connect to it myself. And so my question is, I'm curious on the logistics of the location and the family itself. What was the selection process like? What was it like through the lens of the family being filmed? Just a little bit more of the background there. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So I work very instinctively, and I don't like this term casting, and I absolutely don't like the conventional model of casting, which is I want to tell a story about the little guy who hits it big, so I have to go find that person. One of the reasons why I'm so angry with the commercial model of documentaries, because it creates these demands for, I don't know here so much, but in the UK, let's say, it creates a demand for the perfect subject. I don't even like the term subject, but there's a demand for the people in your film to speak eloquently, to be funny, to be charismatic, to be outgoing, to be good narrators of their own life story, right? All of these characters need to be sort of fairly centrist, liberal, reflect the bigger picture without really being too specific. And, none of that is appealing to me. So that's also one of the reasons why there's not much dialogue in this film, and why when I met this family and realized that they don't talk very much, I really loved it, because it completely contradicts that demand for the perfect subject. So anyway, I met up with the film. The whole idea of the film started when I was introduced to Joshua Minthat, who's a filmmaker himself. He made Burma VJ, if you remember. It was, I think, nominated for an Oscar. So he's a very tough guy. He went through the original revolution in Burma. And he, very luckily, his cousin works in the oil fields in Magway. So I said, great, we meet up, and he'll take me around, and we'll find someone. So that's what we did. We drove around to different towns, and for a while, we did what a lot of the oil prospectors do, is we would ask people, what's the hot lead? Where's the next new oil field? And they would direct us somewhere, and we'd go find it. And sometimes it was too early. There was nobody there. Sometimes it was too late. It was already a kind of a boom town. And we did that for about 3 weeks. I wasn't really happy, but I started filming with someone at least to get some material. Then I came back, and then on the next trip, I said to him, let's keep going. We did it again. And as soon as I saw Shwe, there was just something that I recognized him. I don't know what it was. There was something I recognized in him. He reminded me so much of my own dad. The sort of tough, but when he smiled, you believed it. And this amazing sense that he's pushing you away, but you're desperate for him to see that smile again, right? It was incredible. I don't know, something very beautiful. And I knew at that moment, I said, this is the guy. So I spoke to him. I told him all of this. This is how I work. It's like I meet someone, and then I say, this is what I'm doing. It might take this long. I could come back and forth over 4 years, blah, blah, blah. How do we work together? And that was it. it was a very loving relationship, the whole family, very, very caring, very close. We helped them, they helped us. I really felt like we were creating this thing together. Yeah.
We have a question here. Yeah.
So physicality clearly played a huge role in this film. Constantly, it's almost tiring to watch sometimes because you can see how much effort is being put into just the everyday work of these people's lives. And I'm curious how you felt being where your role was essentially to witness and stand still in this world where their lives were constantly having to be working in the ground, training, for athletics, raising children. I'm just curious how that felt to be the one to reflect that instead of taking part in it, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, I tried to create a relationship where, we established that we were both working side by side. But obviously my work is very different. And they understood that, they respected it. But there's always this question of how much you should intervene, right? Now, for me, it's such a complicated process. It's not, for basic work, I could help them with. But the actual technical side, it's not something I had any experience with. But they never asked for it. They never demanded it. They never expected it. Because we were also working in a different way. So, while they were in the field, we would go get food. We would take the relative to the hospital. We would bring clothing that they needed. Because we had a car, and so we could help take people around. So I felt like, again, this is why I said we helped them and they helped us. There was always this exchange of skill and ability. But yes, I felt lazy because I very often I would put the camera on a tripod and just sit there for hours. My method of filmmaking is very passive, to the annoyance of producers and financiers sometimes, because they'll say, can you make them, what's the story? It's like, ask them where they're going, or are they going to move house? And I would say, I don't know. I'm just watching whatever they do. I'll go with them. So there's a lot of sitting and watching. So you do feel lazy, and they're also much tougher than I am. I just had to admit that. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Yeah, I think that's it. Did that answer the question? Yeah.
Mike? And then here.
Thank you so much. This film was astonishing, and one of the many elements of the craft that I just found myself constantly drawn to was the color. Thank your colorist for me, because I feel like I never get to see digital images that have this richness and this precision, and that made me think that there's probably a rhetoric to the way that you're using color in the film, which I could be completely wrong about, but I felt like in the way that you treated the city and that space, and the kind of light that you produced there, had something to do with the way that you resisted what I think other filmmakers might yield to, a temptation to sort of turn that space and that dream of success as a football player into a sort of triumph of a family with a dream. But I think that you create actually a very ambiguous space, and that you don't give us as much of the kind of the soccer story as I imagine financiers and producers might have looked for.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, just for on the one hand, just how you approach that particular dimension of the story,
Right.
but then also how you're using color to sort of stage a difference in spaces and to create a difference in feeling between some of the different parts of the world that your protagonists are navigating.
Yeah, the football thing. It's also something I did just because I wanted to be a bit provocative. Where it's like you pitch it like this. You know, a kid wants to be a famous football star. There's actually only 4 minutes of football in the whole film. You know, there's kind of aside. But and I was so relieved when I went into the edit suite the very first time, and I said to Catherine, "Look, I got to admit, I don't know shit about football, and actually, I don't really care about it at all." And she said, "Oh, me neither. Don't worry about it at all." I said, "Oh, okay, great, okay." And we did a similar thing with. I've made a film in Afghanistan with the Afghan army, and there's probably 10 minutes of war in the whole film. You know, it was really intentional. Which again, of course, in that film there was a much more political dimension, which was not to give in to this fetishization of war. In this one, in terms of color, I guess it's a bit like what Carolina mentioned with her film, that we didn't want to fetishize the landscape to look like a tourist film. And for me, what informed the color most was that I realized pretty soon the sun is so bright all the time, because I mean it's also quite close to the equator, so it doesn't really change throughout the year. And then at it's the golden hour, right? You have about half an hour before the sun sets when everything looks absolutely beautiful. And 80% of the film is probably shot at that time. So because also it's the only time you could properly expose. So for me, this bright orange and also the orange on skin, that texture of orange on skin was the real, our kind of 0 point whenever we were grading an image. And then the other was just a sense of beauty. So this was also a response to the idea of fetishizing poverty, that there's a lot of beauty in their lives, and they also want to look beautiful sometimes. They want their houses to look beautiful. When you see the ceremony, when the kids shave their heads, I've just forgotten the name of it now, but the Shinbyu, the children become the Buddha monk, and then they become the Buddha priest, and then they become the Buddha monk. That's an incredible, vibrant world, and they enjoy creating that sense of beauty. So we wanted that to come out as well. But with always this sense of realism. So it's that balance. It's quite a difficult balance, just to make sure that none of those narratives overshadow the other.
Thank you so much. You did a great job.
I did also consider doing it in black and white. Again, I'm not ripping off Jessica, because this was before I saw her film, just to clarify.
Should I ask?
Someone
Okay.
has a microphone. Yeah.
Yes, wonderful, amazing film. I am
Thank you.
curious to know more about the music at the end of the film.
Oh, I thought you might ask that. Yeah.
Yes, because although it has a universal theme, geographically it happens in Myanmar. You are a British, Middle Eastern filmmaker, but the lyric was Persian.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I'm curious to know more.
Yeah. So I had that feel, like I said, that we knew the feeling we wanted at the end of the film. And so when I do that, when I start in that way, I always need to know how the film's going to end, including the music. So for me, there's this I really want the end of a film to feel like this moment where it's a puzzle and finally all the pieces fall into place. And for me, music does an incredible job on a conceptual level, because film is very physical, even though it might be a transcendental idea or we're talking about transcendence, but they're real people in a real place. So music provides that kind of abstraction for me. And I have always loved Alim Kazimov. That's the singer. He's from Azerbaijan. He's a Sufi. And so it's a style of music called Mugam, which is a form of devotion in Sufi Islam, but also you know, you base it on a theme. It's an improvisation based around themes and poetry. Anyway, I've always loved his music, and I just listened to music also while I'm writing about the film and editing and blah blah blah. And then this song came up, and it's not one of his. I mean, it's not actually written by him, and it's also a live recording. So it's not, there's a studio recording of the song, but for me it didn't have that energy at all. And what I loved about it, the sound and the lyrics, I mean, for me they're just the embodiment of melancholy. And that was for me always the overriding emotion of this film, was melancholy, and in particular this very conflicting melancholy, which is happiness and sadness at the same time. And for me, I think that's often the most painful experience. I was always relating it to when my mother died. It was long before this film, but I'd had a very bad relationship with my mother. And so when she died, there was this simultaneously this sense of tragedy and release. So it was both pain and peace at the same time. But that's a lot harder for me to deal with than just hating her or just loving her and missing her. And that was the feeling I wanted the film to end with, this conflicting feeling. And so I just rushed in one day to the edit suite and I said, look at this. And Catherine is extremely tough and critical. She's very French. She doesn't bullshit. She tells you what she really thinks. And she's worked with incredible filmmakers. So they told me she's really good. She worked with Wang Bing. And suddenly I got really intimidated because I thought, like, shit, I'm just this like pretender. And she's going to be comparing everything to Wang Bing's films. So I played it to her and she was immediately convinced as well, which I thought was a great sign. There are some others that we tried. It's quite a funny story. So I loved This Bitter Earth. There's a Dinah Washington song called This Bitter Earth, which is beautiful, but it was a little too on the nose because the song is about this bitter earth and sort of a love song. We tried at one point Long Way Home from Tom Waits, which I'm absolutely determined to use it at the end of a film because I think it would work so well. Not quite as well for this film, but we did try it. So it just seemed impossible to ignore when it worked. I think that's probably the best way of explaining it. But also this idea of Sufism as cyclical, and one of the fundamentals of Sufism is this longing for reunion with the Creator, but knowing you can never achieve it. So it had that sense of melancholy to it.
I had a question in the last row there.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll go quick.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know if it's a quick answer though. I just kind of wanted to
My answer's
return
over.
to this relationship between nonlinear narrative and rhythm. Just because I'm a writer, I teach poetry, and this is always coming up, exactly that relationship. And often I'll say to students, that the rhythm is the most important thing. That's always what I think about with writing. And so, and yet I don't mean like a regular rhythm, like a pattern. So I actually don't really always know what I mean. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit more about what you mean by rhythm, because you also probably don't mean a regular pattern. Like when most people think of rhythm, they think of like a beat, and that's not what you're talking about. So I just wanted to see if you had more language around what you mean when you're putting a film together about creating a rhythm that is the film's thread rather than its linear narrative.
Yeah, I would say it's about pace and flow, and there's always a push and a pull, right? The whole film for me is driven by these contradictions, and I always feel I like to imagine that if I'm taking you through my film, there are many ways I can do it. I can tell you, go here. I can maybe draw you a map. I can take your hand and we walk side by side. I can push you from the back. I could take your hand and drag you behind me. So I always think, what is the mechanism that you're taking the audience through the film with? And it's almost like two magnets that the closer you push. So I want the audience to feel like you're always getting a little closer, and especially to Thein Shwe, who doesn't open up emotionally, right, as a father, and again reminded me very much of my father. So this sense that the closer you keep getting closer and closer, but more and more opens itself up in front of you, so you realize how far you really are. But yeah, for me, I think of it as it's very rhythm. The thing is, people say, can you be born a filmmaker or a musician, or can you learn or whatever? Yeah, yes, I think more or less you can learn any skill except rhythm. I don't think if you're not born with a sense of rhythm that you can learn it, unfortunately. But it's also, rhythm will mean different things to different people. For me, it was very much linked to the music I heard when I was growing up. And in particular, Kulthum, there's an Egyptian singer called Kulthum, who's a diva. I mean, was the kind of the most popular musician in the world for a while. And her songs would be, sometimes in live performances, they might go on for an hour and a half, one song. And she would take you on this incredible journey. And she might repeat a line. Her work was often based around poetry, and she would repeat a line over and over and over again, each time maybe a tiny variation. And so it didn't have a traditional narrative, right? It's very different from European classical music in that it's not about efficiently taking you from one movement to the next and then resolving. It's actually the opposite. It's about withholding and removing and frustrating you in a way. And when she would perform, again, Arabic classical music is quite messy. The audience is responding. They're not wearing, well, they're wearing tuxedos, but by the end of the show, men would take their ties off and they would be sweating, and you would have men on their seats and women screaming, and because they wanted to hear the rest of the phrase, right? And they wanted to hear the next line, and they knew what the next line was, but she wouldn't give it to them until 90 minutes later. So that's the kind of music I heard growing up, and to me, that's the most beautiful, compelling way of telling a story, because you have a relationship with the audience. When they move in, you pull back a little, and then you give them a little more. And so that's my sense of rhythm, is this give and take.
Question in the last row. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, so
Hi,
I want
Cedar.
to thank you so much for that. It was breathtaking,
Thank you.
and it touched me personally, a conflict I have inside. My uncle was a Protestant missionary in Burma in the 50s. And so watching this film stirred me so deeply inside. And I think primarily because there is an element of respect that this film imbues, a respect that is beautiful. And it takes away the sort of the missionary romanticism of going and saving people from themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so it makes me want to, I'm a crier.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, me too.
Yeah.
That's actually one of the reasons why I don't always watch the film with the audience, because it's too emotional. I know that sounds very arrogant to say, my film makes me cry, but I don't mean it. I mean, because it reminds me so much of my parents.
Well, I've just never been able to articulate just what in the hell was in my life, because I've grown up with Burmese artifacts around me, furniture, clothing, lots of pictures. My cousins, I have 3 cousins who were born there, and I've never, ever been in a position to articulate it. My male cousins have been like, oh, I want to go get a Burmese woman. And I'm like, like, shut up already. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
And And I've always suspected that there's something that never got talked about with this whole missionary thing, you know. And I don't mean to be rude, you know, but it's just so prevalent in my life, my personal life. And to see this respect embodied, I just needed to say that. It's just really moving me.
Oh, that's I really appreciate that.
Really, it is. And
'Cause,
then
for me, it's probably the most important thing is to show respect for the people that I made the film with.
and then I
You
have-
know, I mean, just to put it in context, we started this project in 2016. The conversation about, you know, representation and who gets to tell what stories was quite different then. I don't know that I would try and make this film again today. And very often Q&As are sort of about that, where people are hedging it and sort of saying, why did you make this, or is it your place? Or, but for me, I'm absolutely confident that it was done with that respect and that collaborative sense. And, you know, everything that I heard from the family, it also said the same. They really thought of us as members of the family. Also, the co-directors were Burmese, and they became good friends, and they helped them out. And we're still in touch, and we keep in touch, and we know what's going on with them. So I genuinely felt this sense of love. And when they said, "We think of you as a member of the family," I truly believed it. So for me, I think they felt that respect as well, I hope. But yeah, the most important thing for me was to make the film with that sense of respect.
It's very lovely.
You know, and also a sense of dignity, because it is a film about labor, and it's a film about, for me at least, is seeing and respecting the dignity in someone's labor.
I do have a question about the title. When was the title born?
It's a kind of a silly story. I just stole it. I stole it from modified slightly from Roger Corman. Is this? I don't know if this is the right crowd for Roger Corman. Okay, it's like the opposite end of the spectrum from
First time at Mimesis, Roger.
Roger
Corman.
Corman. I love Roger Corman. Roger Corman is one of the first kind of block horror kings of Hollywood, and one of the earliest people who figured out how to monetize Hollywood. Anyway, he wrote a book called How I Made 100 Films in Hollywood and Never Lost a Dime, and it was one of the first films about books about film I read. And I went to a talk of his in probably 1998, and I had read that he was working on a documentary about the Rodney King riots uprising. And so I asked him about it, and I said, I heard, you know, I raised my hand. I said, you work on this documentary. I heard you were going to call it Night of 1,000 Fires. And he said, oh yeah, I had the idea, and my students at UCLA did some filming during the riots, but I pretty much abandoned it. So immediately I thought, 1,000 Fires. I'm gonna use that someday. And then another bit of serendipity. You know, this film, so much of their lives is about luck, and that's another reason, by the way, why the narrative is not linear, because their life is determined by fate and luck and astrology and numerology and spirits in every and Buddhism. And so I had made a film, the Afghan film, where this French producer had tried to make it a French co-production, and it didn't work, but we got along well. And then she co-produced another film of mine. So she called me one day and said, which is very unusual because we weren't in touch a lot. And she said, listen, I've been accepted into this development workshop, but my director just fell apart. The project is gone. I have to go there in a week. Do you have any films in mind? And I thought, yeah, I've always wanted to make a film about the human scale of the oil industry. And it's going to be called 1,000 Fires. You know, I knew it already. I knew the title.
Nice.
So that was it.
But there were images of fires. There were candle flames. Oh, there were candle flames. You know, that little orange streak on the back of the snake.
Yeah.
You know, there was
you
the
saw that. That's incredible.
oh yes, I saw
We
that.
put-
We have
You
good
know-
screening
you know
quality here at
how-
Mimesis.
Yeah. Listen, we identified the specific species of snake that has these flames on its back, and then we had to find one in Amsterdam
Wow.
and film with it. So yes, that's amazing that you.
Yeah, I saw that. Well, and in addition to that, it was the Kundalini fire thing going on,
Right.
you know, in the human, you know, experience of energy and spiritual alchemy. So there were all of these ways that fire, A Thousand Fires, became a metaphor for me as I watched it.
Mm.
You know, even this, the fire in the family, you know, it was just whatever. I mean, I could go
Yeah.
on forever, but I won't. But I will, but not now.
No, and fire was central. I mean, I keep talking about these contradictions. The idea of fire as the creator and the destroyer.
Yes.
You know, for me, that the first image of the film is we called it the primordial fire. So it was almost as though this was the flame underground that was compressing, you know, fossils into fossil fuel. But it could also be the fire that engulfs us all when the world bursts into flames. And then when I was researching, so that when I planned my trips, I would always ask the co-directors when is a good time to visit. And Mei Chi Han said, "Oh, we have this New Year's, you know, celebration, and we put candles around the pagoda." So I looked it up, and it's called, of course, the Ceremony of 1,000 Flames.
Oh my God.
And so that was another reason why I felt was the right title for the film.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. By the way, I mean, Cedar was sitting in Peaceful Meadow, and I couldn't work the coffee machine. And I said, "Do you know how to make the coffee machine?" And that's why she came to the festival.
Piggybacking on this woman's comments, there's another association to Burma in Boulder. A lady just died. Her name was Inga Sargent, and she was the Mahadevi of Sepah in the Shan states.
Oh, wow.
And a very interesting connection. I'll try to make it short.
Mm-hmm.
She was from Austria, got a Fulbright scholarship to go to Loretta Heights Women College in Denver.
Mm-hmm.
They put foreign students together. An engineer from the Golden School of Mines met her at a dance. They fell in love.
Mm-hmm.
She said, "You have to meet my parents first." So they went to Austria. And then they got on a boat to go to Burma. And when they arrived in Rangoon, there was this huge festival going on with boats and trumpets and bands and flowers and fireworks.
Mm-hmm.
And she asked, "What's going on?" And he said, "Well, it's for you. You're the princess of Sepah."
Wow.
And he hadn't told her he was a prince.
Oh, wow.
Only in
So-
Colorado.
I didn't hear.
It can only happen in Colorado.
So she melded into the culture beautifully, and they had 2 children, and then he was the coup happened, the army took over and kidnapped him and killed him and put her under house arrest.
Okay.
She escaped eventually, came to Boulder, and was always on guard for anybody like you that had something to do with Burma that
Wow.
might come to assassinate her,
Okay.
because the Burmese government
You got
wanted
me.
her dead.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But she died just February of this year.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And there's a book, and there was a Hollywood film about her story because it's so dramatic. Twilight Over Burma.
Oh, okay. I don't know it.
Maybe related to that, maybe last question. I wonder, there's a line in the film, "You will only find honest people in the cemetery."
Mm.
You speak against the conventions maybe of observational cinema or direct cinema, maybe the myth of the hero, the sort of naive filmmaker. We heard them from Jason yesterday morning. And yet your camera stays silent. Your presence behind the camera stays silent. There are a few moments when we feel people peeking into the camera, maybe when they drive out of the training, the soccer training, or when they talk about the hat, now you're the movie star.
Yes, exactly.
Were you conflicted by that, or were you winking at us in that scene about honesty and truth, illusion and reality in documentary, in that line, in that scene?
Yeah, I usually like a moment in my films where I sort of poke the audience in the eye and remind them of the construction. This is probably the least obvious one. In my other films, it's much more obvious. I mean, and in my earlier films, you hear me talking behind the camera to the people I'm filming, so I'm much more present. But yeah, for sure, the line about the film star was for us really that kind of. I mean, it was a beautiful moment, but it's also a way of reminding people that I'm there and that this is a construction. And that all of it is a construction, but you know, in a way, it doesn't make it any less real, because I'm constructing this world with the family. So, you know, in a sense, I'm not saying it's more real, but once you agree that objectivity doesn't exist in the pure sense, then the construction becomes a lot more free, I think. And it becomes a lot more freeing. So there are ways, you know, this idea of transcendence through cinema, you can only really do once you accept that you're leaving objectivity behind and you're looking into a spiritual world, trying to both feel it, I mean, experience it, and then reflect it in the film.
You're born on a Friday, you speak the truth.
I am born on a Friday. Did I say that in Bristol? How did you know?
No, you didn't say it in Bristol, but we have our sources.
Did you calculate?
Thank
It's really interesting. They were very excited. So they kept asking me to work in the industry with them, like invest in my business because you're Friday born. I mean, that's a really good sign. Yeah, I don't know.
It's a Saturday evening. Thank you very much. And do you have something?
No, just thank you so much. This has been so stimulating. And Toma, you're so great at, you know, moving it along. But the tentacular reach of I mean, just how you've talked about this film, and then the incredible pace and rhythm and silence within it, just all, you know, going from Kalsum to the Dharma and so on. And I just wanted to comment on the, you know, the future, you know, the predictions when they're giving out advice to people and combining that with the, you know, the Buddhist stuff, and then all these other levels of existence going on and where you're going to be. It's just that there's incredible humor in there, but also that you let it have its own reality was so beautiful. And all the children, just amazing. I feel, you know, hopeful.
Oh, thank you. Great. That's great.
So yeah, it's been a great night. Thank you.
Thanks
On
so
a
much.
hopeful note, I thank everyone, and I would like to remind everyone who has oh, okay.
I think, well, we're going
An
to lead
announcement.
the audience in a rendition of Kulthum's Inta Amri. Just kidding. I think there may be another song.
Yeah, Said, you were born on a Friday, but Toma was born today, 36 years ago.
On a Wednesday.
On a Wednesday. And I would like everyone, if we could wish him happy birthday and just sing happy birthday. So, okay, birthday to you. Yes, be careful. To you. Happy birthday, dear Toma. Happy birthday to you.
I forgot it was your birthday.
Okay, thank you, everyone. If you have tickets for tomorrow, and don't forget to
Caribou
vote
and
for